Hey Bible lovers, I'm Tim Nichols, and I'm here to bring you a little bit of a different type of Nicholsworth today. I actually just finished reading Tim Wildsmith's book, Bible Translations for Everyone, and I'm going to share a few thoughts on the book itself, and I'm also going to share maybe a couple of different areas where Tim and I may disagree when it comes to the idea of Bible translations. Now, I want to give a disclaimer. As I've said multiple times in my translation read-through videos, I am not a Greek, Aramaic, or Hebrew scholar, so I don't know the original languages. I rely on faithful Bible translators, and I trust the scholars that make these Bible translations happen. And I just simply share my experiences as I read through the Bibles on my own. I've read 15 Bible translations to this point. I'm actually working on my 16th right now in the World English Bible. So I definitely have a good overview of the spectrum of English translations, going from word for word all the way into thought for thought. I've never actually read a paraphrase before, but as I dove into this book, one thing that really stood out to me is the simplicity of it. Look, when we are trying to weed through which Bible translation to read, when we read the four words, we read to the readers, or we go online and watch videos, a lot of times there's this highly technical talk, and it's very difficult for the average person to weed through that. This book eliminates all that technical talk. This is in common everyday language. This is a book that anyone at any reading level can read. I read through this in just under 2 days. I would say it probably took me about 2.5 hours total to walk through it and read it. It's really an excellent overview of English Bible translations. And there's a few things Tim does in this book that I think really stand out. Number one, he gives you an overview of English translations leading up until really what was the pinnacle, the King James Version, and then the updates subsequent to that. One thing I really appreciated is he acknowledges the Revised Version, which is one we don't talk about a lot, that was completed in 1881, and it is to date the only official, recognized by the Crown of England, update to the King James Bible. All the others that claim to be updates, they may be updates in spirit, but they are definitely not according to the Crown. And I really appreciate that he gave the Revised Version the credit it deserves to really being the father of all modern English translations. If it weren't for the Revised Version of the Bible, we probably don't have a lot of the modern translations that we have today. I also love that he took time out to give credit to the ASV as really spawning that in the American sense of things, to where the American Standard Version really is the father of pretty much every American English translation that we have to date. And I think that was awesome to give that translation credit. Even though I have some issues with the translation itself, I have a bunch of videos that I've done on my read through of English translations. I'm going to put that playlist on the end screen so you can kind of walk through that. But this book really serves as an easy read to help us understand not only the history of the English Bible, but then he moves into something very important, and that is called the translation spectrum. Now, in this image, you see the translation spectrum. The translation spectrum goes from word for word, which is trying to keep the original wording as closely as possible, all the way down to thought for thought, which is really majoring on understandability and somewhat sacrificing the word for word nature of it. That's a big controversial topic, and Tim does a beautiful job of breaking down each translation, where it stands on the translation spectrum, what they did well, what they could improve, and he really just does a phenomenal job breaking down each translational style and how it can work for us and help us understand God's Word better and really give us what we need. Another key feature in this book is he gives us the textual basis for each translation, and this is a big controversy. The textual basis for most of our older English Bibles was the Textus Receptus, put together by Erasmus in the 1500s, and it's undergone a few revisions, but ultimately up until more modern discoveries, it was considered the received text of the church and the inspired Word of God. Later on in the 1800s, moving into the 1900s, the critical apparatus, which is really a makeup of several different manuscript types, grouping them together, and there are several different categories, and I don't want to get into the technical talk on that. I've done a few videos on that I'll put on the end screen or the video description just to let you kind of walk through that if you want to take the time to. Ultimately, modern scholars have almost universally accepted the critical apparatus, the Nestle and the Land, and several other manuscript groups that use critical resources that we have today, such as the Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and all sorts of modern fragment and papyri discoveries, which they believe gives us a more complete and better understanding of some of those older Bible terms that we may not have necessarily had back in the 1600s under the Textus Receptus. Another thing that this book does a very good job of is he goes through each of the popular translations today, shows what side of the translation spectrum they fall on, gives some of their strengths and weaknesses, and really walks us through how choosing a Bible translation can be very important based on where we are spiritually, where we are in our reading ability, where we are in our theological persuasion. He even covers Catholic Bibles in here. I think he does a great job, really, of giving us an overview of each translation using non-technical terms that anyone at any reading level can understand. Because look, weeding through the myriad, hundreds of English translations that we have today can be a very difficult thing. And not all of us, like myself, are going to take the time to read through 15, 16 different translations, because that takes a lot of time. It's difficult to read through the Bible twice in a year, so you're talking a several-year process before you can even really determine which translation you like the best. For most of us, we just kind of rely on our pastors, and whatever version our pastor preaches from, that's what we end up accepting. And if we don't understand it, we just muddle through it and struggle, to where Tim really gives us the tools we need in order to be able to not only understand the philosophy behind the Bible that we read, the textual basis behind it, how to use the footnotes and all the nuances that the average reader is just not going to pick up on their own. And again, I read this in about 2 hours, so this is not a difficult read. And then you have a good overview of the world of English translations and which one may really help you grow the most spiritually. Now, there are a couple areas with Tim that I do disagree with, and we have lightheartedly jabbed over these things in our 3 Tims video series and back and forth over text message. And one of them is he seems to align with modern scholarship that the critical text is better. Now, he doesn't go and state that in this book. He's very balanced, but you can tell there's a leaning in that direction to where he prefers the critical apparatus over the Textus Receptus, and I probably take the opposite position. I am a Textus Receptus preferred manuscript guy. Because of that, I have landed on the New King James as my translation of choice. It has not been updated since 1984. The textual stability of that translation is one thing that I really like. He has actually advocated for an update of that, which has led to some comical exchanges between the two of us. And it looks like for those hoping for an updated text to the Textus Receptus, hope is on the horizon, because the MEV has finally gotten its update. Several of the mistakes have been fixed from the initial edition, and now we're going to have the best of both worlds. We're going to have a modern English translation from the Textus Receptus, and we're going to have the New King James from the Textus Receptus, and then we have the tried and true King James. So we're going to have something older with that older, beautiful English. We're going to have something a little bit more modern than the New King James with that beautiful King James poetry and cadence and style, but in a little bit more of a modern language. And then we're going to have the MEV that updates it all, and they're all going to have that formal equivalent, word for word, as much as possible, renderings, which is my favorite. Another thing I disagree in this book is that Tim talks about the Message Bible, and he mentions that he believes it's a translation because he goes back to the original languages, and even later on it was reviewed by a committee. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if you go back to the original translations. It doesn't matter if it's done by committee. What matters is the translation philosophy. And when you read the Message Bible, it is very clear. It is not word for word. It is definitely not thought for thought. This is really, by definition, a paraphrase. A paraphrase is when you take words and you rearrange them in order to help people understand them. The NLT is very, very, very close to that spectrum, and you have the Message, which is way beyond that. So ultimately, to call that a translation, I'm just going to disagree with that. And of course, this is also lighthearted. Tim and I are friends. And among the Bible community, he's probably one of my best friends. I really appreciate his perspective. We disagree on a lot of things, and I think that's what makes the Bible community awesome. But this is a book that I can fully get behind. This is a book that I can fully endorse. This is one that I really hope that every one of you not only read, but share with your friends, because it is super helpful. I actually learned a few things in this book that I had never heard before. Just some little details about the translations and who was behind them and certain things that happened as a result. Just to give you an example, there was a guy named Howard Long that was an engineer, was actually behind the translation of the NIV that happened a couple decades later. Really cool story behind that. You'll have to read it in the book to find the details, but you all get a copy of Bible Translations for Everyone. Read it, share it with your friends. This is such a simple read that really gives you an overview of English translations, and I think it is something that's going to be very useful for decades to come. God bless you. Keep calm. Jesus on. This is your Nicholsworth.